everybody. So today we have a super exciting webcast with David Turvey and Stephen and Timothy Maloney and Mike Conley as guests. And they're gonna discuss basically minerals, thorium, and super exciting happenings and events in regards to this topic. So yeah, Stephen.
Hi, so my name is Dr. Stephen Boyd. I'm a chemist here in the United States. I'm currently in New York, and my graduate work was in fluoride salts. And specifically, I did a lot of work on lanthanide doped fluoride salts. So I am familiar with this, and we actually also, we had joint group meetings weekly with the geochemistry department, specifically at Dr. Brian Phillips in the geochemistry department. So I'm reasonably well schooled in in kind of the geochemistry / solid state chemistry world of minerals, and thorium and uranium bearing minerals as well.
David.
Yeah, David Turvey. I'm in Adelaide, Australia. I'm a geologist. My specialty really relates to new business development in the lesser known specialty minerals rather than the main industrial metals and minerals. So I have looked at, evaluated, and done business on elements on the periodic table like thorium, and the relationship between thorium and the rare earth elements, which are quite topical at the moment, certainly for new technologies. So I've evaluated mineral deposits and their development for the better part of 30 years in those industries. Thanks, Yrsa.
Yeah, Tim.
All I know about this topic is that Mike and I researched an issue about a year ago regarding the monazite sands on the east coast of the United States, in the state of Georgia, by the way, containing enough thorium in that sand such that 5 pickup trucks of the monazite sand would be sufficient to power the city of Savannah, Georgia for a day, or something like that. We wrote it all up in a big footnote, and we're gonna splash that in the book when it comes out.
Mike?
Hi, I'm a writer, and I'm kind of a nerd, and I got really interested in the subject about 10 years ago, and I've been hanging out with all the scientists ever since, and my basic pitch to them is explain it to me, and I will explain it to the world. And so that's why I'm here. I kind of make all this stuff digestible to the average person. So that's what I bring to the table.
Mike invents metaphors that enable non-technical people to understand technical issues, including deep physics issues regarding nuclear fission.
Yeah, we even came up with a thing about isotopes and ions that we explained in like 2 short paragraphs that anybody in 8th grade would get.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really needed because it's a complicated field for the average person.
Yeah.
So basically,
and it's not that complicated. It's not that complicated. They just have to like have an analogy to go, oh, it's that. Okay, fine. They're boiling water or whatever. Because it really is simple. It's just the technology behind it is really difficult, but the result is very straightforward. Right? So you don't have to be a hydraulic engineer to understand plumbing.
Yeah. True. So I have a question to ask basically. So what would it take basically to set up a supply chain of thorium? Basically, where are we currently in the world markets, and where do we need to go, and how do you think we can get there basically?
Well, I'll take that one first, Yrsa, because it starts with the occurrence of the element thorium on the planet Earth behind me. And thorium is not particularly rare. It's at least 3 times more abundant in our planet than uranium. It does have a strong association, as I said, with rare earth elements, a group of them. And the main mineral that is mined. There are a couple of them that do contain thorium. Is the mineral monazite, which Tim mentioned earlier, which is a rare earth thorium uranium phosphate, and the mineral bastnäsite. Both of them are mined in the world. Bastnäsite has been mined in the US historically, and the mines in China for the rare earth minerals have both bastnäsite and monazite, and the Mount Weld mine in Australia, Western Australia, a relatively newcomer to the development scenario, a decade or so, is effectively a monazite mine. So the answer to your question in supply is that supply is not constrained. Monazite occurs in a number of geological settings. Tim mentioned earlier the mineral sand mines in the southeast coast of the US. Those mineral sand mines are driven by the production of titanium-bearing minerals. Titanium dioxide is produced by processing those minerals, and it goes into principally white pigments. So anything that's white on the planet, whether it be plastic, paint, etc., ceramics, has titanium dioxide in it. That is the driver of that industry. That industry does occur around the world, from Australia, both East and West Australia historically, about 25% of supply. East Africa, the Ukraine does produce titanium dioxide from these mineral sand type deposits, Sri Lanka, India. So it is very, very widespread wherever you have sand on beaches or old beach type deposits and the black mineral sands in them. You have a percentage of the mineral monazite, which is mined, is concentrated, and depending on your country, is reburied as a waste mineral because of its radioactivity and not processed. So they separate the titanium minerals from the rare earth monazite, rare earth thorium-bearing mineral monazite.
Right.
So,
okay,
there is
ahead,
a world trade in the mineral monazite historically. So I'm just answering your question of a supply chain. Supply is not the issue.
Yeah, supply is definitely not the issue.
It's not the issue, definitely not the issue. It's a regulation. Sorry, let me start earlier. It's the lack of a demand pull, so a lack of a market to sell it to, thorium. And then it is the regulation around handling, both producing and handling that thorium.
Yeah, that's correct. Thorium is considered to be a junk metal. Thorium and uranium are coincident with the other lanthanides that are typically found in monazite. So monazite has basically two components. It's got a metal component, which is typically +3, okay? And then it's got a phosphate component, which is -3. So they balance out to a charge of 0. It's a very robust crystal. It's very difficult to solvate, and typically you use very harsh and kind of ugly methods in which to break it apart. The thorium is tossed aside. I, for one, right now could secure roughly 1,100 metric tons a month from a guy that I know who's processing monazite in Canada right now. In slight contrast to what David said, titanium-bearing monazite, titanium-bearing monazite doesn't necessarily predominate here in North America. Here in North America, we have predominantly lanthanides, right, which is the top row of the periodic table way down at the bottom. And then we have coincident with that, the thorium and the uranium. They are in roughly around 2 to 4 or 5% of coincidence, as we find in the different deposits here in the United States and in Canada, more importantly in Canada. And the reason for why I say that it's a little bit more important in Canada is because monazite is really, really important for some strategic elements, right? We want neodymium coming from it, and we want samarium, and we want dysprosium. Unfortunately, the monazite deposits here in the United States, by and large, are devoid of the samarium and the neodymium, as well as the heavies, the so-called heavy lanthanides, which are of huge strategic and national importance. So the thorium is tossed aside. It's junk, and they even leave it as the nitrate or the oxide, depending on the mineralogic processing methods that they use, and then they just junk it. As a matter of fact, 2 years ago, I got a hold of a guy at a very famous, huge solid state chemistry company in Europe. I'm not going to use the name. He was willing to sell me thorium dioxide for $100 per metric ton. The problem is I had to buy 10 metric tons of it in order to qualify for that price.
How difficult would it be to get the oxide out and to use the stuff, or do you need to get it out? You do, because you don't want it in the MSR. So how do you reduce that to just plain old, good old thorium?
I would have stopped him. Yeah, I would have stopped him and said, whoa, 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 please don't give me the oxide. Please give me the nitrate, right? The nitrate hydrate would have been a much more reasonable version of the thorium. Because
you can crash out the nitrate easier than you'll have thorium than crashing out the oxide? Okay.
Yes, that's correct. So thorium oxide is very difficult to break. And the reason is that oxygen is such a miser, right? Oxygen is a real miser. It wants to really, really hold on to whatever atoms are around it. In this case, thorium. Thorium dioxide, THO2, has one of the highest melting points known to man. Really? And it's entirely due to the presence of the oxygen. If you get it at the nitrate, you're going to spend a lot less money converting it into a more usable form of the thorium. In the case of molten salt reactors, if we were to propose an MSR driven by thorium, then you would want it to be thorium tetrafluoride, THF4. It's a very reasonable fluoride salt. It has a reasonable melting point, and you can do a lot more with it. As Mike just indicated, there would be no oxygen around, which oxygen you don't want in a working molten salt reactor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the issue, Mike, is the actual processing of the rare earth, where it's done, by what process, and what residue materials come from that process. So each deposit, as Stephen said, is slightly different in its monazite and the valuable components in the monazite. And those valuable components, currently valuable components, and in fact critically valuable components, drive then the processing method that will form the residue or residues which contain thorium. So it is a variable related to the variable input started to that. Stephen then reflected on what would be the best material to then process to a molten salt reactor. And the logic is the more reactive and the fluoride is a logical material. So my question to Stephen, rather than the oxide, which will be, in all intents and purposes, rather difficult to process because it's quite stable and virtually inert. Having said that, thorium oxide is probably the most valid material to transport and store for any length of time, as opposed to a thorium fluoride salt, and Stephen, please correct me when I finish, is a little more difficult to handle and store, though it'd be easier to use at the other end. Could you comment on that statement, Stephen?
Yes, you're exactly correct. The thorium oxide, if I would sleep on it, I've got my kids right here, and I would have them sleep on it because it's not going to do a darn thing. The thorium tetrafluoride, however, is far more reactive, right? Because, you know, chemists, we use kind of like we use delta G, right? That's very famous. We use the Gibbs energy as kind of a general measure as to the reactivity, as David just pointed out. So the delta G for the thorium tetrafluoride is a lot less negative than the thorium oxide. The thorium oxide, you can park a tank on it and you can burn it, you can do whatever the hell you want with it, and it's not going to do a darn thing. The thorium tetrafluoride, however, is far more reactive, and that's another reason why I said you really don't want any oxygen or air around, because it can have a tendency to form thorium oxyfluorides, right? Because it, you know, again, oxygen is very difficult. Sometimes oxygen is your friend, but in the field of solid state chemistry or inorganic chemistry, where I kind of, you know, live in that space, you really never want oxygen or water around, ever. Because David is absolutely correct. It is far more reactive. And so that also requires a little bit, it's actually pretty trivial, but it does require a little bit of extra handling. Typically what you do to handle thorium tetrafluoride and to keep it safe and anoxic, right, or anoxic being no oxygen, is you just apply a cover gas. Typical cover gas, nitrogen. It's plentiful, it's cheap, it's totally unreactive, and will not form like, you know, fluoronitrides or some sort of, it just won't. And so it's a really cheap, very effective gas to use and safely transport and move the thorium tetrafluoride. Now, that said, if it does get exposed and you do have a little bit of oxyfluoride forming, don't worry about it. It's not going to explode. It's not going to do all sorts of bad stuff. You can tolerate a little bit of oxyfluoride formation if you were going to take a big, whatever, a metric ton of this stuff. If you have, 0.5 to 1% of oxyfluoride formation, that's okay. You could still dump that in to a molten salt reactor and you'd be okay.
Where would the oxygen go? Would
the
the oxygen bubble off?
Unfortunately, the oxygen is going to attach to whatever it wants to. It depends. So to answer your question, Mike, I would need to know what the makeup is of your MSR salt, what your eutectics are, and then I could better answer your question. Right. But the oxygen isn't going to go away, and it's certainly not going to bubble off as O2.
Okay, I got two other questions related. One, you pointed out that nitrates are a lot easier to separate than oxides when it comes to thorium. So, and then you also mentioned that we don't have a lot of the heavy lanthanides in the US. And so my question is twofold. Is one, we would obviously want to purify thorium from a thorium nitrate residue than a thorium oxide residue. So does the thorium in the US lend itself to nitrate residue when it's separated from whatever it's in? Do we wind up with thorium nitrate or thorium oxide when we deal with the thorium in the US? And if we don't have the heavy lanthanides, where do we get them? How can we bring our industry back from China if we don't have the heavies?
David would be in the better position to answer that, because Australia, from where he hails, actually has bastnasite, monazite, and churchite in relatively reasonable concentrations found, in Australia. We're relatively limited here in North America, and I very much include Canada, okay, because we are almost completely bereft of heavy lanthanides here in the United States. In Canada, they have a reasonable amount of, quote, of lanthanide heavy monazite in certain deposits in Canada. One just a little bit north of Toronto in Ontario, and then there's another one roughly 600 kilometers to the west in, I believe it's on the border, it's near Yellowknife. And I believe that's the other major monazite deposit.
Well, would that be our heavy lanthanides if we were to bring U.S. defense industry back? Because if we don't have it here, we got to get it from somewhere. Will Canada cooperate? Or their anti-war people say don't sell it to them, they're going to make bombs or whatever? You follow what I'm saying?
I do, and you're largely correct in that Canada's going to sell it to whomever Canada wants to. There really isn't that level of kind of political pushback, if you will, for rare earth elements in general. And the reason is that can be very easily argued that you need those lanthanides for cell phones, you need those lanthanides for cell phone towers, you need those lanthanides for nacelles in wind turbines. Everybody loves their iPads. I'm on an iPad right now. You need lanthanides for iPads. And so you can really easily make the argument that it's for all things, of which the military is a small slice of that.
But the important thing is to bring, if it is important to the U.S. to bring back military from China, so we can use lanthanides here instead of over there. If we don't have the lanthanides, we have to buy them from Canada.
Yes, that's true. But, you know, in the United States, we seem to be lovers of adhering to the law until the law no longer suits us, and then we just simply break the law.
Well, of course.
It's okay. We don't have to go into U.S. foreign policy or
U.S. democracy and foreign policy. We'll steer away from that. We've had some of that.
That's another podcast.
Exactly. So, Timothy, did you have a question?
I have a question. Yeah, when we hear about large quantities of thorium discarded from rare earth mines, what chemical composition is that? Is that the oxide, or what is it?
It's actually usually the oxide.
David, maybe.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's generally a mixed residue, so it's not a product as you see it. So we're quoting thorium oxide really as a potential pure product. There are very few rare earth processes at the moment where the residues are of a purity that can be used. They have to be refined further, so to speak. So the answer is it is a mixed salt at different stages of the process that does contain thorium. There will be nitrates, there will be sulfates, there will be oxides in the materials at different levels at different states related to the material. So it comes back to saying what product could you use? And that's a commercial question because it costs you to refine your residues.
Exactly.
So
that's my question about
there's a commercial imperative here that what do you want thorium as, and who's going to pay for the cost of processing it? And the supply side is not the issue. The actual occurrence side, the amount of it there, it is effectively a waste or a residue. I like to think of it as a residue, and dealing then with the processing of residues to make it a transportable form, but more importantly, a usable form.
Well, so then my question, I'm sorry, I apologize.
No, then I'll just reflect on, no one is doing that because there is no demand for thorium in a pure product form.
Okay, well then my question is, Stephen.
There is a rare earth sense. So back to what Mike said, there are moves afoot to develop heavy rare earth projects specific to the heavy rare earths. Northern Minerals in Australia, as Stephen mentioned, has a heavy rare earth pilot processing facility on site at the moment in the Kimberley area in Western Australia. And recently, we're talking 6-8 months ago, although it probably took 2 or 3 years in germination, Lynas, an Australian listed company, produced light rare earths from their Western Australian deposit and their Malaysian processing facility, have signed an agreement with the US to take residues from their Malaysian facility to heavy rare earth residues to refine in the US for US consumption.
Well, cool, because that's my question, Stephen. That whole big plan about a thorium bank in the U.S. and using that for molten salt reactors and getting the idea of the heavy lanthanides to bring U.S. industry back. That's all dependent on what kind of thorium deposits are available in America and what kind of residue results, and whether we have enough heavy lanthanides to pull that off. If not, we have to import from Australia or Canada and refine the nitrate stuff and get the heavies. And so how realistic is a US thorium bank for the purposes of molten salt reactor fuel and heavy lanthanides as distinct from light lanthanides and thorium oxide that's going to be a pain in the ass to make into thorium for molten salt reactors? So you follow, I don't know if I framed the question correctly, but I hope you get the drift of it.
No, you're exactly correct. And David hit the nail on the head. As a matter of fact, Linus has been intimately involved, as well as with Rio Tinto, by the way. But Linus predominantly in Australia has been intimately involved in the mining and then the transport of the rare earths. And now very recently, very quietly, the only current rare earth processing facility in the United States was just built in the southern United States. And I'm pretty sure that that's exactly what David is actually kind of indirectly referring to, is that we will be receiving those rare earths. Somebody has to build a bulwark against China.
Yes.
And it is invaluable that we have such a robust relationship, as America has such a robust relationship with Australia and with Linus in particular for those heavies. Now, to the point that you raised, Mike, you seem to be obliquely referring to John Kutch and Jim Kennedy and their heroic efforts at trying to create a thorium repository here in the United States under federal law. Now, to your point, the answer is that it's kind of a lousy idea, right? The current iteration, and I think the most robust, and I think frankly the one that's going to succeed, is that it may reside here in the United States, but it will be an international repository for thorium and related. In other words, there will be some uranium that's going to go along with that, as a direct result of, as David pointed out, basically the chemistries, breaking down those chemistries and utilizing those residues, bringing them to the next stage, basically segregating them as David had said. You're going to have sulfates, you're going to have nitrates, you may have a little bit of chlorides, you'll have some oxides all in there. And so you're going to have to make those extra steps. You're going to have to spend that extra money, as David very correctly pointed out, in order to refine it a little bit further, because it is in those more refined stages or forms that you're actually going to have storable materials. The latest iteration is actually going to be an international agreement among all of the monazite, churchite, bastonite, and even ilmenite in some cases, processing facilities around the world, to be able to, for everybody to play in the sandbox correctly, right? Everybody wants to have a single uniform repository where this material can be kept. And so I think that there are some limited, pretty interesting, but limited efforts here in the United States. But I think that Australia really is holding all the cards. And to be honest, David, if you'd like to comment on the current federal administration, the current presidency, and I see you smiling there because there is a lot of stuff going on in Australian politics right now with respect to the prospect of nuclear. And that would have a direct implication on the thorium and the uranium that frankly is already being pulled out of the ground on Australian soil. David, would you like to comment on that? Because there's a lot of Australian politics going on. And Yrsa, I know that that might be, they're unfortunately inextricably intertwined when it comes to Australia and rare earths.
No, I'm very excited. I think it's a great question, David.
Yeah, and it is a good question because there is the politics of rare earths that Mike has reflected on, and the strategic supply of rare earths currently and for the future, whether they be light rare earths or heavy rare earths. And with that becomes the politics of allied elements, being the uranium and the thorium with the rare earths. So politics is front and center, and it's the social agenda. And this is why Mike is very, very useful here, to help people understand the social impacts, perspectives, benefits, opportunity of the utilization of these elements and demystify the science.
Well, it sounds to me if the U.S. is going to bring back their high-tech industries that use heavies to the U.S., then that's going to be mostly dependent on a relationship with Australia and Canada, which up till now has been just hunky-dory, and I don't think it's going to change. So that seems okay, but it isn't a totally homegrown. It's more of a global workaround to China being the dog in the manger.
Yeah, and this is what Stephen's saying about the repository of the bank of thorium or the bank of heavy rare earths. It will be an international supply chain, back to what Yrsa had said, and there will be politics involved with it. Because there will be the storage, the cost of refining of residues related to the processing of those minerals or elements or residues.
Well, then the only other critical question is the heavies, the supply chain of heavies from Australia and or Canada sufficient, Stephen, to bring our military industries back from China, or is that just a pipe dream?
It is. It's not a pipe dream. The amount of rare earths that are needed by Japan, by the United States, and that could be supplied by Canada and Australia, as well as a couple of other locations which are super exciting, but I'm not at liberty to talk about. I am working very, very hard right now on lanthanide chemistry to be able to make those things a reality. I maybe at a future point I can talk about that, but unfortunately right now it's super exciting chemistry. But we've had some really, really good. As a matter of, I've just been texting prior to getting on the meeting here with you all. I've just been texting about X-ray diffractometry and FTIR and all sorts of other stuff.
That whole thing is going good.
It's going very well. It is going very well, and I think that 2021 might be a very good year for the lanthanides as well as for thorium. And the reason why I mention that is because very few people talk about the non-nuclear uses for thorium. I've written somewhat extensively, and I just got published on it actually last year online. On the uses of thorium. It is a wonderful material. Yes, it's a wonderful material. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting material and has a lot of very interesting qualities about it that have nothing to do with making it a fissile material. Just the metallic and crystallographic properties alone, and to a lesser extent, but a significant extent, the actual catalytic properties that are involved with certain types of thorium compounds that can effect interesting chemistries, in a catalytic fashion. So let's cross our fingers, guys, for 2021 being a good year for thorium and lanthanides.
Yeah. So I'll get back to Mike's question. I see the issue with. I don't see an issue in the heavy rare earths and the US and the global high-tech utilization, perhaps driven by military. I don't.
Okay, great. So if we can import it, then we can bring our industries back. Basically, if we have a safe route for importing, then we can bring our industries back.
I don't see the cost of supply as being a particular issue, and the politics can and will work on those heavies at this particular point in time. I'm enjoying Stephen's comment on then looking at potential future demand and uses for any mineral, whether it be light or heavy rare earths, but more importantly, thorium. Because the issue at the moment on thorium is there is no price on thorium. Right. Stephen earlier said it's considered a waste and you could buy it, from whoever had whatever type of material around the world rather cheaply. That's its own problem. In other words, there is oversupply. There is not a price. It's a bit like just compare thorium with carbon. We had this whole global debate related to global warming on putting a price on carbon. And that price can be a negative price related to the cost to the planet of producing excess carbon by burning fossil fuels and then reflecting that back. Thorium has the same issue, and it's probably a good way to think about it. Unless you have a demand that is price driven and there is a need or a want to replace global energy in a proportional sense with thorium MSR, in other words, thorium nuclear, and a benign, safe thorium nuclear, then we're not even in the first page yet. So I would almost reflect on the processes that have occurred socially on the price for carbon related to the environmental side of renewables. And by the way, the renewables use a lot of light rare earths in the renewable production, particularly wind energy. So
They sure do.
Look, these things are inextricably linked. So I come back to my point, unless you have demand and unless you have the social agenda driven by a price for thorium, then you'll never really drive the cost of refining. So it's a bit like saying, I want a closed circle recycling of all these nice elements on the planet. Not fear them, just have a look at their utilization and their use, right, and put an evolving regulated price on it. The issue with the thorium and uranium is that it can get used for other applications, particularly military or particularly uranium-fired power stations, where they have a stigma, for want of a general word, on them. So it's this relationship between demystifying the stigma and looking at the good questions you've asked, Stephen. How do you produce it? How do you transport it? How's it best used? What form is it best used in? The supply is not the side, not the issue.
Well, the use is going to, Stephen's chemical breakthroughs will, open up a door for use, which will set a price and a demand and a price. So unless you have a use, right?
The demand will drive price, not cost. Stephen will come up with a cost, and it's really demand back onto that cost structure which will form price.
No, I understand that, but it is as if you can create the demand by coming up with a method of applying, of getting it into a useful form. If you have a way to make a material into a useful form, suddenly that material thus derived is a lot more valuable because now you have a way to get it from the ground to the vehicle.
Yeah, having said that, rare earths and then processing the thorium residues is a costly process. That is supported at the moment by demand and price and demand growth, significant demand growth for the rare earths.
Yeah, David is exactly correct. I was just on a conference call this morning with a colleague in London, and I'm trying to actually get her over here to the United States, because the only thing that I focus on when I fly to the middle of the United States to do my lanthanide and thorium chemistries, the only thing we focus on are cheap chemistries, either green chemistry synthesis or near room temperature chemistries, as well as, and this is important because hopefully by February or March, as well as exactly what David just referred to, which is the processing of the monazite. That is a nasty business, that is high temperature, that is very caustic, because almost invariably the acidic pathway, so to speak, is chosen over the alkaline pathway because it's a bit more effective in terms of the chemistries, but it's more effective in terms of the cost. It is a very nasty and costly business. And so that is exactly what I'm focusing on. I'm focusing on the three aspects. It's called digestion. The digestion of the crystals, the monazite, the bastnasite, the churchite. So I focus on the digestion. I focus on the segregation or the separation of the lanthanides from one another, because that's a very tricky bit of chemistry. Mm-hmm. And then I focus on the reduction, right? Meaning getting it back into metallic form. Right. So I focus on those three because those three things are critical. If we can get a quote one-stop shopping where we go where we have cost-effective methods for the digestion, the segregation, and then the reduction back down to the metals, well, we have a very, very powerful toolbox at that point. And that is super important for us. To Mike's point and to David's point, it is super important for us to stop being tethered, and in fact, I would argue strangled by China on their monopoly on the heavies and the overall abundance. They have ample monazite and churchite deposits in Western China. As a matter of fact, it's located, it's really neat. I can't, what is it called? It's Devil's Mountain. I think it translates into Devil's Mountain. They're just north of their rare earth deposits. There is so much iron in a mountain range. They call it like the Devil's Mountain range because it attracts so much lightning.
Wow.
It lights, and you can watch it from space. There's so much lightning that gets attracted to this short mountain range because of the extremely high presence of iron. And this is just north of some of their main rare earth deposits in like Midwestern China. So, you know, it's very tricky business. And like David said, it's inextricably linked, unfortunately, to the politics and the geopolitics.
Yeah, it's important
Yes,
for
Stephen's
rebalancing.
on the
Yeah,
cost
sorry,
and the
David.
environmental drivers. I do like what Stephen is his drivers, which are lowering the cost and developing environmentally reasonable processing methods.
Yes.
For rare earths, let alone then the thorium from that. So
yeah, but Yrsa, you're correct. We need a rebalancing. We need a more even playing field. You're correct, I think, to use that word. I think that's an important use of that word. We need a more even playing field, you know, on this planet when it comes to rare earths. I can comment from firsthand experience, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times I've encountered the Japanese. The Japanese scour the planet. They consider it the highest priority is lanthanide and uranium chemistry. They literally have it budgeted into their national budget every year. They consider it the highest priority. And the relatively recent discovery of a fair amount of heavy lanthanide deposit in their it's north of Hokkaido. It's right on the edge of the Kurile Islands, and where the Japanese chain ends and the Kurile island chain begins between Russia and Japan. It's right in that disputed area where a very significant heavy lanthanide deposit was found.
Well,
coincident, of course, with thorium and uranium. And so
to that point, are they actually Japanese islands? Because the Japanese and the Russians are still arguing about those fucking islands.
They're still fighting.
But my point is, if they start mining them in earnest, are they going to get like flybys by, you know, Russian bombers or whatever? Is there going to be an international situation?
They probably will, because Sakhalin Island is unfortunately the closest Russian populated island, but it also is considered a relatively strategic naval base because it's located so close to Vladivostok and
They've been going on about
Novosibirsk.
this shit since 1905. It's just like the Crimea. No, really, it is.
Agreed, Mike, I agree. And the Japanese agree with you. And that's the reason why they literally go all over the world to look. I met them 3 times here in the United States. Okay, in the Japanese contingency's search for rare earths. And as a matter of fact, I met them in Chicago, I met them in St. Louis, twice in St. Louis. And so it's very serious business for them because, you know, as Yrsa said, I honestly think that the world needs to be balanced again. We cannot have this be you know, held, you know, at the ready by China. It has to be a more even playing field, and the Silk Road Initiative by the Chinese, unfortunately, I think presents yet another threat. Look at the copper infringement that's occurring as a result of Chinese quote unquote investment in Africa, right? They're giving fabulous amounts of money with truly untenable interest rates and conditions and terms for the loans. So now we have, and as a matter of fact, David can comment on this because the coltan, so coltan is a portmanteau of columbium, which is the old name for niobium, and tantalum. And coltan is found predominantly in the DR Congo, but it's also found in a number of other areas. Really? And yes, and in a strange way, there also is coincidence with the finding of coltan as well as monazite or lanthanide lanthanide-bearing rocks in Africa. Africa has very different geologies, very interesting geologies, but they're relatively distinct from the rest of the planet. You really don't see, for example, and David can comment on this, you really don't see the presence of coltan and columbite crystals and tantalite crystals found outside of the African continent, unless you look at certain parts of Brazil. Certain parts of Brazil produce huge amounts of niobium and tantalum as a result of their relatively distinct geologies. And then again, the coincidence with lanthanides, so rare earths and thorium and uranium in Brazil. As a matter of fact, my colleagues flew down there not even, 2 years ago, and spent like 2 weeks traipsing around mines and mining concerns that have rich monazite deposits, and with the added bonus of some coltan deposits which are complementary, which are very nearby.
Is up in the jungle?
Yes, unfortunately, yes, yes.
Yeah, so I'm wondering about the supply chain there and that, but you know, it's interesting, watch China, because they're colonizing Africa. It's going to be their labor pool, and it's going to be a wealth of minerals. When they electrify the Congo, it's all over, you know, if they can ever settle the place. But I think that's what China's big project is to colonize Africa. It's going to be China Inc. over there. It already is. And that's going to be a huge implication for world politics and commerce, is when China controls Africa.
Look, I don't think we have an issue with it, and they have every right to do free trade in their own sweet way. It's been done over time throughout empires. So let's not be hypocritical about any cultural.
No, not at all. No, not at all. I mean, no, that's just a march of history, and I understand. All I'm saying is it is going to happen. It is going to change things in a big way. Not like, oh, evil China. It's just that's what humans do, and those humans are doing that.
Yeah, and China is putting under its very organized political system, is developing faster than anyone else in the world economically, and they are leapfrogging most nations because they are taking the current technologies of nations and then just supercharging it and looking at supply and demand, and they will be controlling, and do in fact control, the supply of rare earths. They in fact do control the demand of thorium in molten salt reactors as well. So they are doing more work than anyone in the world on the commercial side of thorium molten salt, to the point where they are looking at balancing, back to what Yrsa said, their energy demand by energy supply from various sources. They are being more realistic than every country in the world in its balancing of energies. They realise that they can't have 100% of currently known renewables. Let's just call them solar, wind and hydro at the moment. It will not work because of the density of energy that's required by industry, not just population. So they realise they have to, and do in fact, burn a lot of coal for the moment. They also realise that they kill people by doing that because of the pollution related to the coal-fired power stations. So they do have uranium, and they are doing thorium. So let's not be critical of them. Let's just admire the rapidness of the capitalistic process that occurs in China. They are the most effective, voracious capitalists on the planet at the moment, because they have the most organised political system.
No, it wasn't a criticism, it was a reality. That is going to be changing the world in some very dramatic ways. And we have to realize, I don't think the U.S. has quite sunk into the average American how big China is. And y'all are a lot closer, so you see it. I don't think a lot of Americans really get it.
And we supply them, correct. So we are a bit closer in that. And America has been satisfied with its own standard of living and its own size of its economy that has been developed over time. So it's fairly in a self-satisfied position at the moment. Whereas countries like the Congo, if they can get a buck for selling their country, they will. They'll sell it 3 or 4 or 5 times.
Right.
So let's not be critical of that. So they will. But back to thorium. It's really, I liked where Yrsa went on the rebalancing side, and I've just given a little bit of a monologue there on China being more advanced than the rest of the world in looking at how effective it is as a proportion of energy supply. And that's, I think, where we need to focus, because I agree with you, Mike, we are asleep at the wheel in that
Yes.
we're not selling or marketing the benefits of thorium energy. And that is in not cost or price. It really is the clean and green side of thorium, of which Stephen has talked about getting there. And we need, in a supply chain sense, to say thorium energy is safer than X, Y, and Z. It is greener in a carbon sense. It's certainly greener than the fossil fuels. And the density of energy is superior. So it's more getting across the simple messages to people that socially, this is a very, very sensible thing for us to look at. And by the way, it is common as in its occurrence. So it all comes back to the politics of producing thorium energy.
It's very true. It's very true.
The science on the way can be done. There will be costs. There will be commercial realities to this, and reality checks brought along the way. And Stephen's looking at reducing the cost of processing rare earths, and therefore the cost of supply of thorium. Thorium at the moment, you could set up a thorium molten salt reactor, and your thorium cost would be inconsequential.
Yes.
So the operating cost of the supply of the fuel, in fact, you would probably be paid for it.
Yes.
Let's put the number at 0, because a waste, recycling a waste, you should be paid for recycling, not cost.
Totally agreed.
There is oversupply of thorium. It's solely the regulation and the, let's use a harsh word, because I can be an antipode and a harsh Australian, the stupidity of not using thorium molten salt reactor as an energy supply is ridiculous. But people are ridiculous, other than the Chinese that are well advanced on the rest of the world in looking at the commercial reality of thorium molten salt reactors.
Well, the Chinese have enough money to try anything. And the U.S. is predominantly interested in building up a big military, scaring the crap out of everybody. We pissed away how many years in Iraq, and while we were doing that, China was colonizing Africa.
Yeah. Look, I'd reflect on that, and I agree with that. They do have the money at the moment. They do have the drive. So their drivers are a bit different to the rest of the world. And I'll say the rest of the Western world is very, very self-satisfied with where they are and want the status quo to stay where it is. Whereas China will just go out and get it and, in fact, leapfrog the world. So, yeah, that will happen. That's humanity in it. So it really, from a thorium perspective, I see thorium as being, hopefully, at least 30% of global energy supply for the next 200 to 300 years. Sooner we can market that, understand that, cost it up. And I come back to my previous premise. It's the cost of carbon analogy. I'm very comfortable to have 30 to 50% renewables around the world and the evolution of those renewables. I'd be very comfortable to have 30% thorium-fired power, because bottom line, the barriers to entry are social, they are political, and with the politics, the world, and I'll put US as a significant driver of that, militarization and nuclear weapons and uranium-fired power are inextricably linked, and still there, it is a barrier to entry to thorium. So if you want clean power, the uranium industry across the planet is one of your barriers to entry. Barriers to political common sense, and that should not be used in the same sentence. But political logic, social logic, let's depoliticize this. Social logic, the uranium sector worldwide, and either the energy side of that or the military side of that is a barrier to entry to thorium. It has been for the last 80 years, since the 40s.
Which is unfortunate. You know, it's unfortunate because you can't move a thorium molten salt reactor forward without uranium. It's neutron deficient. You must have the uranium kicker. You have, and you will always need the uranium kicker. You will always need the uranium kicker. Because unless you have some magical neutron source.
It's a bit like any of these systems, you know, you often need a firing pin in a gun as well. So, you know, you need a detonator, you know, to create these energies and harness them and utilize them. You do need different types of energy flows, and you do need different elements. So they are inextricably linked in occurrence, and they're inextricably linked in the evolution of the science of the production of low-cost green energy, being thorium energy. You will use uranium.
Yeah.
At the moment, you'll use uranium until, Stephen, you can come up with some sort of chemistry that initiates the reaction even better.
Well, yeah, you need that lighter fluid to get the barbecue going. You know, you need the lighter fluid to get the barbecue going.
You need the lighter fluid. That's right. Correct. So, to me, the agenda more is not a supply, and it's not a mineralogic. The mineralogy side and the processing side is a cost. We can deal with that if we can then look at the demand and setting a pricing.
Right. And
that demand will be driven by the social green side of thorium energy, exactly the same as renewable carbon energy.
Which is why we write. I mean, that's what we're writing about. Exactly, David. You're exactly correct. It's the social demand. It's the social fear. It is not cost prohibitive. If the focus is on clean energy, it's not cost prohibitive in the least.
In the least.
Right. It is all politics and psychology and nuclear fear.
So I think the key thing for me is people's understanding, and I might bring Timothy in here, the people's understanding of the need for energy-dense energy supply. So the processing of many, many materials on the planet needs relatively dense energy. People themselves can go out with a small little solar cell, go out into the outback and almost be self-sustainable just using solar. That's very good for one person. But if that person wants to drive a car out there, that car can't be done by renewables.
Well, speaking about that one person, you need a society and an industrial society and a supply chain to make the equipment so that guy can live at a clean and green arm's length from the rest of us dirty people.
Correct.
Mike wrote this up as another metaphor in the book we're finishing up here in the next few months. You made a reference to Henry Thoreau, I think it was, Mike.
Yeah.
Trying to live at Walden Pond in a cabin, and he had to have a tool made in a iron foundry.
Yeah, he needed the axe was not made by people like Thoreau. The axe was made by the people that Thoreau was getting away from.
Right.
Yeah, so it's a social recognition of industrialization. So if we want a standard of living, so to speak, and you want to drink your latte and sit with your mobile phone or your iPad, 1, you need mining, 2, you need processing, 3, you need a density of energy that renewables cannot supply if the majority of the world is to have that lifestyle.
And cheap, low-cost coffee bean pickers.
Yeah, and also about being a bit proactive with it, which is kind of what you guys had the debate about China and the US, is that the US doesn't seem to be as proactive in its how do I say, behavior when it comes to energy. It seems to more have stagnated, and as you said, like seems to be satisfied with the level that it is currently at. And also, ironically, when you brought in the military thing, it does undermine the military too, because it's a question of energy security, and with AI and 5G and all of this stuff, all of this is going to need not the same amount of energy that we have today. It's going to need a lot more energy than we use today. So it is becoming a question of national security. I think Mike touched upon that a bit, so definitely.
You're exactly right, Yrsa. You're exactly right. And here's an unpopular but opinion, which it's not opinion. It's unfortunately it's a fact. You have to admire the Chinese, because the Chinese realize that generating electricity is a lousy business model. The reason why is because everybody wants cheap electricity. Well, how are you going to sustain a capitalist model of generating electricity that by definition, everybody wants the absolute cheapest stuff? It's just like electronics, right? The prices for electronics go down, they don't go up, right? You want the cheapest, electron coming out of that electricity generating power station, be it nuclear or what have you. You want the cheapest. Well, what have the Chinese done? The Chinese have realized that, hey, wait a second, I can operate a molten salt reactor at 600 to 700 Celsius. Well, wait a second. Some of the most popular and energy dense materials on Earth that are used on every single continent can be made at those temperatures. There's where you're going to make your money. And the Chinese know that.
Industrial
Making
heat.
electricity, right, industrial heat. The Chinese know that. Making electricity can, as far as I could tell, and because I agree with it, because my first degree is in international finance, as far as I could tell, you're going to go make electricity at a loss, at a business loss. Who's going to make money off of 4 cents per kilowatt hour? The answer is nobody. But that's exactly where our planet is going. We need more electricity, Yrsa, as Yrsa just correctly noted. We need more electricity that's cheaper, not less, with AI and 5G, as she had just mentioned.
And air conditioning.
And air conditioning, right?
Yeah.
And all the, so the smart business model is with an MSR, because you're going to use some of that energy coming from fission to go turn your turbine, move your steam or your working fluid, whatever that is, and generate your electricity at somewhere between 4 and 6 cents per kilowatt hour. But where you're going to make your money is using the rest of that heat toward driving ammonia, right, synthesis, toward driving carbon activation in order to make jet fuel. Right. Right, exactly. Reverse osmosis desalination. That's where you're going to make your money. And then take it a step further. Whatever isotopes you're getting out of that salt upon desalination, go refine those isotopes. Then you're making $100,000 a kilo. Now you're talking about a reasonable, profitable business model that is doing both at the same time, providing the planet or the region, whatever, or the nation state with cheap energy, but then satisfying the shareholders by making a hell of a lot of money on the back end in processes that nobody ever sees. They just benefit from it. Right? Because process heat is wonderful. It's the equivalent of, here in the United States, the Niagara Falls, right? You've got this wonderful amount of energy that's just sitting there waiting to be utilized, but at such elevated temperatures that we can take on the processes for making ammonia. Ammonia takes 2% of the world's energy production per year to make ammonia, NH3. And the reason why is because the optimal pressure and temperature for making ammonia is around 300 Celsius and around 100 bar of pressure. That's a really serious situation that you just put yourself in.
But that's easily accomplished with an MSR. This buku heat, and that heat can be used to make pressure. So
yes,
it seems, yeah. And the ammonia is mostly for fertilizer, right?
The ammonia is mostly for fertilizer, yes. And so, but that's just one example. You can have high temperature syntheses that will make you a hell of a lot of money. You can even do the water shift gas reaction and the Fischer-Tropsch process in order to make jet fuels and diesels out of natural gas. You can make dimethyl ether, which would be an excellent bridging molecule. And a very clean one, by the way, for diesel fuels, for diesel engines.
So it isn't the energy, it's the heat, and more heat, more money is basically what you're saying. More heat, more money. And the thing is an LWR doesn't run that hot, it can't. And so you don't get the process heat out of a light water reactor, you have to get it out of a molten salt reactor.
Yeah.
So, and that's what Kush was talking about. I mean, Kush was going on about how in terrestrial energy, I think it was him realizing that the money isn't in electricity, it's in process heat.
It's in process heat.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do. As a matter of fact, I gave a talk in North Carolina a couple of years back where I presented a molten salt reactor, a rubric for a molten salt reactor where you don't make 1 kilowatt hour of power. You make an MSR 100% dedicated to process heat. And that, by definition, is going to be your most profitable molten salt reactor that you could ever make, because you're going to be making more money than you know what to do with, because you're operating.
Would that be 750 at the outlet, or would you make it run it higher, like to 1,000?
I'd run it at about 750. Yeah, I'd run it at about 750. Because of the chemistry, the in situ chemistries that occur. It's a real sweet spot for MSRs of the particular flavor that I'm actually interested in.
Yeah, so look, Stephen's brought up some very good points there on energy demand, energy cost, and heat, Mike, as you said. So thorium again can be marketed to produce, as Stephen said, things like ammonia, which go to agriculture, which go to feeding people. So it's these links you, Mike, mentioned, thorium and heat or energy to desalination to, again, agriculture. You know, the world will be with increased population, and currently is in many parts of the world very, very short of water. Yeah. The world with increased population and currently short of food. I've just mentioned that they are both energy intensive in increasing the availability and lowering the cost of both those. The fundamental life will relate to our utilization of energy, even at the most basic levels of food and water.
Our third book is going to be Power to the Planet, and it's going to be focused on how the stuff works and what you can use it for. So the whole thing about process heat for fertilizer is going to be stuff in the book, is like, what do you do with all this heat? What do you do with all this electricity? How can we use this heat and electricity to clean up the planet? And so it isn't just electricity, it's also the process heat. And so I'm really looking forward to that third book, because we're going to get into all this desal and ammonia and all that good stuff.
You guys could probably advise me whether there's been any simple, let alone scholarly, let alone highly technical articles on the, let's call it, techno-economic evaluation of thorium MSR. Let's simplify it and let's demystify it, because it just needs to be promoted as this is clean and green, and this is the cost effectiveness of this. In other words, this is future energy, guys. I don't care. I already read about it. Yeah, how do we market it, Stephen? You know, we're here talking about it, and we believe we understand some of the logic to the science behind it, and in fact, logic to the social benefits. And now we need to make it a social imperative.
Right. That's why we're writing. I mean, that's the goal of the books we're writing. You know?
Yeah. Are you writing, or are you making a movie on it, or how are you? Let's call the word promotion. How do you promote a book? How do you get the energy behind a social agenda. You Americans are actually very good at this, I've seen recently in the capital. So the social agenda is very much in your forefront.
You
So
wear the
how do
horns, you can get anywhere. I'm telling you, you put on those horns, you can get anywhere.
Yeah, well,
honestly,
maybe
David,
we could do a Viking approach. Yeah, the Viking approach to thorium. Not bad. Thor
honestly,
was
David,
was a god.
you do what, as you just indicated. I mean, I think America is pretty good at selling stuff, but you do, at the risk of sounding crass, you do what all marketing agencies do. You find gorgeous women who are intelligent and can and understand marketing. And I say that very deliberately, because there is a supermodel on Twitter right now. She goes by the handle of Isodope, and she is incredibly clever at the presentation of the material. And she uses herself, I kid you not, she uses herself as the canvas. So she does fashion, and she has what, 20,000 followers already, and she's been doing this for only 4 months. She's absolutely gorgeous. Her name is Isabel Bemke. I believe her name is Isabel Bemke. She goes by the handle Isodope, and you should see it. She is completely pro-nuclear, and she's doing exactly what her industry has trained her to do, which is basically sell the product. And sell it through beauty, through sex, and she's amazing. She's absolutely amazing.
I'm a bit more politically correct here in Australia, so I do want to de-genderify it and not just use beautiful women. I can use beautiful men and beautiful whatever gender you want to be to market these things. So I think we perhaps, yes, we need books, and they're always very useful for people to work through, to try and understand the whys and wherefores of say,
sure,
multiple reactors. Okay, so they are important, and we saw that in the carbon debate and the renewable debate. There were some pivotal books. Love them or hate them, they certainly polarized thought process, and in fact started to establish social agenda. The other medium that you've just mentioned there, yes, we can get on the Twitter and the YouTube and be very pretty and paint ourselves a picture. But why don't we get Marvel Comics behind it and get Chris Hemsworth and Thor with his hammer talking about how, in a galactic sense, thorium has been left by the wayside, but is now the refound energy source for the galaxy. But let's demystify this and just put it into DC Marvel Comics and put it out there about the quest for thorium and get Thor onto it. That would be
to that
my
point.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to comment on this. I think especially my generation, I don't know if all these like older market strategies, like, I mean, of course they do bite, but to some extent, like for instance, Greta Thunberg, she probably has a lot more followers than the model that you're referring to. I think like my generation in general is just very concerned with kind of like not like the science behind it, but like the ethics behind things.
Right.
So I think like targeting this would be like successful, like writing books and stuff like this, or podcasts or webcasts, like, yeah, to get the word out there.
Well, there's a couple things we're going to do. Is one, we're going to have podcasts of the book, or I guess books on tape is probably a way to do it. And podcasts, if people want to talk, that's fine. But I'm also, I want to get moving forward with a documentary. So the books will be like a coffee table companion to the documentary, or break it down into like, I watched a couple of semesters of Civil War history, lectures at Columbia and Stanford, at Yale. And the way they did it is they took a whole semester of courses, they broke it up into little 8-minute videos. And it worked quite effectively. And I know that we have to work with somebody to take our books, break them down into bite-sized chunks that could be like little quickie videos or whatever is the exact format that appeals to your generation. You follow me? And it's just a matter of breaking it down the right way, and that's fine. Every generation has a different need, you know.
Yeah, Tim, sorry, because Tim wants to talk.
Oh, I'm going to ask a question to David and Stephen. In the calcination of limestone for the production of concrete, that operates at about 1200 degrees Celsius. Am I right on that?
A bit
The
lower,
calcining. Yeah, go ahead, David. You're going to answer it. Yeah.
Even if we get a molten salt reactor with a discharge temperature of 700 degrees Celsius, can we make up the thermal energy lack from electricity alone, or will we need to burn fossil fuels to raise the interior temperature that lasts 500 degrees Celsius? Is that possible?
The answer to that is yes. You would need. It's really a number of stages within calcination. It's not just an end point, and certain parts of calcination do need higher temperature. So you do need an amplification of your temperature input for calcination in cement.
There's an amplification.
700 is a good start, and that will start it and give you a nice base. But you do need some injection of, say, higher temperature, and that's generally just gas-fired or something like that, where you have control of your temperature profile in the calcination.
That's what I'm asking is, can we move the natural gas out of the process and take the last 500 degrees temperature achieved from electric heat resistance heating?
Bucknell covered that at TIAC. Remember that speech by John Bucknell? He talked a mile a minute nonstop for 15 or 20 minutes. You know, I mean, you have to watch the video again to catch everything he says. But basically, he goes into some sort of technology where they can compress the exhaust and increases temperatures, like a turbocharging the heat. I forget what it is, but Stephen, I could show you the lecture if you missed it, or the presentation. But it sounded as if for a very modest amount of energy, you could do some sort of like mechanical trick or compression trick to up the temperature.
Tons of tricks available. There are lots of tricks.
And Bucknell was talking about one that sounded very feasible. I should send you, Tim, and anybody who wants to see it, that video, and he explains the whole thing right there. And it can really boost it several hundred degrees. I don't know. Do you familiar? Am I tweaking anything with you, Stephen, on that process? Some sort of
yes.
thing?
Yes, there are a ton of tricks in the scientist's toolbox or the engineer's toolbox to be able to pull this off. Yeah, so I'm actually not worried about achieving those temperatures. I'm really not. Like David said, we're going to have a very solid foundation. You know, a jumping off point of 750 Celsius is completely fine by me.
Right. If you have to tweak down a little bit of electricity, who cares? You know.
Yeah, but Tim,
right.
You've got to ask yourself the drivers behind in a very large industry like cement, why you would want to get away from the fossil fuels, because the calcination of limestone produces an enormous amount of CO2. So if your objective is to reduce CO2, then don't blame the fossil fuel, you know, blame the cement, because the calcination creates an enormous amount of it.
And how effective are we at trapping all that CO2 when you calcinate limestone? I mean,
we're very effective.
Okay.
Oh yes, we are very effective. And the reason is, as David just correctly said, one of the products on the right-hand side of the arrow in some of the most famous chemistry equations is a whole boatload of CO2. But that said, it's being evolved as a gas. And so that is directly going up the flue. And so we can capture that. I cite the example of Royal Dutch Shell that in 2006 capped their flue stacks and ran pure CO2, almost completely pure, 99+% pure CO2 down and into the old legacy tunnels underneath the city of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Where did it go? It was rerouted to all of the greenhouses in and around Rotterdam, and they had a huge CO2 boost. And so they literally stopped the evolution of CO2 gas up their flue pipes. We can do the exact same thing with cement factories. And unfortunately, here in the United States, there's no upper limit.
Then if we
no
don't
cap.
need the CO2, can we like mix it up with base salt and turn it into something solid?
Yeah, how about jet
similar-
fuel? How about jet fuel? How about jet fuel? Let's make CO2, and we need a hydrogen source, and we can go make jet fuel with it. And there's a value add right there
Okay.
that we can easily use the 600 to 700 degrees Celsius temperature window from an MSR to be able to pull that off.
All right. So you have carbon
without
neutral
question.
jet. You have carbon neutral air transportation and clean concrete. So.
Yep.
All right. Okay.
Doesn't concrete also take up CO2, like after it's produced, like in buildings and stuff?
No, it does not. I mean, David, help me. I don't think so. No, it does not. Unfortunately,
it's relatively inert once it's a concrete, Yrsa. That's
right.
The whole rationale behind producing a cement or a concrete is that it's an inert, structurally sound material. It does break down over time, but it doesn't really emit CO2 back.
That depends on the concrete formula.
Yeah,
Because the concrete formula, because there's a reactor that was built using the Roman concrete formula with volcanic ash and seawater, and the concrete is 3 times stronger than when they first poured it. And I forget what reactor it was, but they used the Roman formula for the concrete there, and it got 3 times as strong. And so the Roman concrete formula is not difficult. It's volcanic ash and seawater is the trick. And it leads to be behind tolaramite or some sort of weird whatever, and it makes it super strong. And so it can be done. The formula has been revived. I think
it comes down to a cost and a political will, and that relates to the market. If you can make a buck out of it at the other end, or if socially, politically, you're obliged to recycle or reutilize or have closed circuit processing, then sure, it can be done. There are drivers of it, and the politics and the cost are key drivers, and that's what we're here today to do. Is to
there was some lady at MIT about 10 years ago, I think it was MIT, and she figured out the formula after all these years. And I
remember seeing that. I remember seeing that, Mike. And but you know, to just a minor correction here, Yrsa is correct from the perspective that calcium oxide, so CaO, can be driven to CaCO3, so calcium carbonate. And the same thing also holds true for magnesium, right? So the analog to the calcium oxide being one of the main components of Portland cement or concrete, the lower analog, the upper analog to magnesium oxide, so MgO to MgCO3, some CO2 can be taken up in that fashion. So chemically, you are correct. The problem is it's very, very slow. And when you're making concrete and you're making structures, engineering or structural types of components, you really don't want a lot of surface area. Right? Concrete type objects are very surface area minimalist, right? Because you want all of that energy in the geometry to go toward supporting whatever you're trying to support structurally. So you do not want very much surface area at all. So, but chemically speaking, you are correct. It's just that concrete would be not an effective way of doing that, because your whole goal with concrete is to minimize the surface area and maximize the structural integrity of what you're making. So chemically, Yrsa, you are correct. It's just that would be a very low, efficiency process of taking up CO2.
Take a couple of thousand years.
Like a couple of thousand years. Yes, like a couple of thousand. But chemically, it's correct. Chemically, it is correct. And then what you would want to do, of course, is then calcine the MgO or the CaO and calcine that off, right? So you'll have MgCO3 or CaCO3, and you calcine that material to drive off the CO2, thereby capturing the CO2 and then using it as a reagent in a chemical equation, right? Not just letting it escape into the air, but capturing that CO2 and go put it to good work.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. So there's, I
Mhm.
mean, there's small percentages. Maybe one can take off like a promille here, a promille there, but as David says, might take thousands of years. So better to do the thorium molten salt.
Better to do a
faster.
thorium molten salt. A lot faster.
Yeah.
Oh, and I
Yeah.
like where Stephen was going with this, Yrsa, which is the closed circle of utilization of the heat,
Yes.
let alone the energy of thorium molten salt. So in a marketing sense, the clean green nature of thorium molten salt, we need to quantify, we need to promote, we need to look at educating the population, and that includes all politicians. If that's possible to educate a politician, I don't know that. That's probably a step too far. But really the social agenda to it on this closed cycle utilization of thorium in a molten salt system. That's where we need to get.
Yeah. So I think we're basically heading to an end here. Are there any like last comments? Any Mike is
Buy my book. No. The book, Fear of a Nuclear Planet, should be out in the next month or two. We're just wrapping up the editing, and I have a possibility of some funding for publication, and that I'm going to explore. And things are looking good. Then we're going to revise Roadmap to Nowhere, and hopefully that'll be out by the middle of the year. And then me and Stephen are going to team up in earnest on the third book. And Power to the Planet. Hopefully that'll be out in the next year or so. And then I'm going to retire and watch the river run. No, I'm gonna move to East Tennessee, and I wanna be around the nuclear city, you know, Oak Ridge.
Well, Mike, just keep your fingers crossed, because I'm working on, like I said, I'm working on some pretty exciting lanthanide chemistries. I've chosen a CEO for a hydrogen project that I'm working on. So this has been really fun, guys. This has been super fun. And maybe I can update you, in the next maybe 60 days or so as to, any forward movement. We got some really good information back from the attorneys on a particular type of licensure that I'm going to need. So that was very encouraging. I might even have in my inbox by now the X-ray data that we've been gunning for on the chemistries that I've been working on in St. Louis and Chicago. So that's super exciting. And I just got off the phone with let's see, this was today's Monday. I got off the phone on Friday with 3 different national laboratories here in the United States on a CO2 capture solvent. So that's super exciting. And obviously the complement to the CO2, in order to go make things like, jet fuel or what have you, any value add molecular streams, we need hydrogen. So we need cheap hydrogen. And so I've got something in the works for that. So hopefully we can reconvene in the next 2 months or so, and I can update you on hopefully some pretty good results. Hopefully. Keep your fingers crossed.
Yeah. So you got that federal licensure stuff taken care of, huh?
By and large, yes. We have a very clear pathway toward the licensure. Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
that's the key thing.
So that's very
you can do all the happy horse shit you want in the lab, but you can't move forward unless the feds will, bless you.
That's exactly right. And so it's a very costly blessing, I guess. We're going to be paying for the tithing, right?
Dominus vobiscum, baby.
Well, I'll just finish on one last story before I let Tim tell us his last story. So before jumping in, Tim, I'll tell my final one, and it ties things up for me. It relates to the background behind me of the planet, space travel. It comes back to what Mike Connolly said on cements, and the federal government of the US. They gave me a consulting gig to look at space shuttle tile cement glue.
Nice.
After we had or you guys had the disaster on tiles peeling off space shuttles and space shuttles not enjoying that, NASA, driven by the feds, actually asked, how can we improve the quality of the glue? And glue equals cement in this case because they're ceramics. So how do you glue a ceramic to a fuselage? And someone found me. And the irony of the story is that the glue got improved by the recycling of a material generated from a coal-fired power plant, and the flue dust, the dust that goes up, the stack in a coal-fired power plant, creates a thing called a cenosphere, which is a small sphere with a very thin wall that occurs as the dust goes up and the temperature decreases, and you dispose of this dust either in a dam or in a bag, wet or dry. And these silica cenospheres, nothing special about the chemistry of this little spheres, occurred a bit like popcorn on water. It looked like foam on top of the dam, and people just came up and scooped it up, put it in a bag, and that was sold to NASA for many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars, because that cenosphere was the strengthener in space shuttle glue.
Super exciting.
That's cool.
So it's
Bravo.
exactly the way we need to think about thorium molten salt reactors, the monazite that is the feed to it, the utilization of the rare earths in whatever science you want to use them in, and then look at the benefits of thorium molten salt reactors, particularly the energy cost. But I'm more not driven by cost and price. I'm driven by the green and the safety side of this for the next 1,000 years.
The cost will come around if it works like that.
The price will come down, that's right. Yeah, as we've stated before, it will come down. So it's much more making this closed cycle on what do we do with the thorium residues from rare earth processing. Well, we actually want thorium molten salt reactors off the back end of every bit of rare earth processing around the world. And that's what China will be doing right now. They'll be using their thorium residues for thorium molten salt reactors.
Super.
And that's where we need to get to, is this closed loop on using the thorium and whatever else comes out from that mineral monazite. And by the way, the mineral monazite, when you do process it, you do produce phosphatic fertilizer as well. So, you know, you use virtually everything in that little mineral. It's a rare earth, uranium, thorium, phosphate. So it's stories like that where, look, the US feds didn't know me. I didn't even ask who gave me a reference, but I was approached by NASA to source larger amounts of better quality silica cenospheres. And by the way, there's only a couple of places in the world that can do it. And it's not the US, even though the US burns a lot of coal in producing energy, because they use different sources of coal commercially. They will buy.
So where do you go for your stuff? Where do you go for your cenospheres?
Well, you go to a couple of men who control the business worldwide.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Because it's such a valuable material, but it's so simple that it comes from a particular type of coal deposit and not a particular type of process, but it's that's coal burning and energy, you know, generation from that. It's basic technology, but it comes down to the feed that's put in that coal plant. We have something very rare in the world, which is in Australia, we have mine mouth power stations. One mine, one power generator. That's not common worldwide. You have big generators that buy in different bits of coal. Well, that means you get variable cenospheres. Some with thick walls, some different sizes, some. It's the reactivity of the cenosphere in the glue. So what Mike said, it is super, super strong. It's stronger than steel, okay, as a bond, because you've got a very thin sphere of reactive silica and alumina to bond with an aluminate cement. It's effectively a cement reacting with a lightweight, so it creates a lightweight, really strong glue.
So these are like
cement.
little nanoparticles, these cenospheres are super tiny, like
Yeah,
your previous
it's a good question. You can use them in different sizes, depend on the size of the popcorn you like.
Okay.
Really. So they naturally produce themselves in a sizing going up the stack. You can scoop them up, and all you do is sieve them. You do get a bit of breakage of these little. They look like crystal Christmas ornaments. Okay, glass spheres. In effect, they are.
Are they crushed, or are they left as spheres to put
No,
into the
they're
glue?
whole. You want them whole, and you want the maximum surface area and maximum reactivity you're right, at a size that suits the density of the glue. So
Cool.
it's the amount of centispheres you use relative to the reaction.
Stephen,
So
how
it's a
come you
bit-
didn't figure this out?
Well, you tried. You were very annoyed at having to buy space shuttle glue from Australia, I assure you. You were really annoyed. It took NASA a long time to actually come clean with why they wanted this stuff. Or even ask the question, where do I get it? Simple question. Where do
I
I
don't know
get
why
it?
they just didn't design the back of the tile with a thing so it slides into place on the hull. You know what I mean? Like a kind of a, like, you know what I mean? Where you could slide the tile onto the.
Well, that's science and evolution of technology. So I think of thorium exactly the same way. I think the way Stephen thinks about it, we want to utilize, and we're all talking about today, we want to utilize the energy. We want to utilize the energy for the good of mankind or humankind. It's de-genderfied is for humankind. And the logic is thorium, where it sits on the periodic table and the way its thermodynamics, its products, its materials, as Stephen said more eloquently than me, does have some very interesting and very useful materials in it.
Oh, yes.
Thorium can be and will be, and I'll predict here, will be spectacular. We just haven't got there yet.
Totally
We
agree.
just haven't asked the right questions of why this element that's sitting down there called thorium, why aren't we using it? Good question to ask. Because there's some real good logic there that we should be using it yesterday.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree. Wholeheartedly agree.
So Timothy, what's your final little story? I want Mike to write another book on space shuttle tiles with me.
David, the name cenosphere, does that come from the dimension of the popcorn or the elemental chemistry? What is that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Timothy. If you're British or if you're Australian, you tend to use the word cenosphere. The Americans wanted to use microspheres, so it does come under a number of names, but I actually like the shape of the word cenosphere and the logic of it being a Latin derivation related to size, I imagine. Yeah. I don't know the derivation of the word, but that's the one I actually like to use.
Well, it's related to 100, cent 100, like centurion. So there's some 100 microns. I don't know. You know, maybe it's
you're right. The logic will be that 100 micron. 100 micron is an interesting and sensible dimension when you're looking at cementing things. Mm-hmm. A glass, 100 micron is very, very pivotal in any glass reaction. So if you go below 75 micron, you screw it up. And if you go above 200 or 300 micron, in an energy sense, in a melting sense, in a reactivity sense, whatever
so
way
the
you want to make it.
Sweet spot is 100 microns?
Yeah. 100 microns is a good number. It's a sweet spot. It's a hard spot to get to. You use the term nano.
There's your cenosphere. Then you can just tell people that
the
they'll buy
logic
it.
is 100 micron is the useful nano, if you like. Yeah, I agree.
I don't really have a story. I just know that we're trying to put something into concrete in order to puff it out and get rid of stuff that otherwise will have to sit around in landfills. And some people are working on the notion of taking the fibers from discarded windmill blades and grinding them up and putting them into concrete and somehow helping the binding energy of the concrete. I don't know.
Well, no, but it is what that is, Tim. Is it's not the fibers. It's just a blade is usually balsa wood and then fiberglass and resin, and the fiberglass is just like the rebar in concrete. And you chop that shit up, and you get these chunks of trash that will bulk out the concrete in the same way that gravel will bulk out of concrete. You follow me? It's a cheap fill that could be grabbed by the concrete slurry because it's not smooth. So it'll be grabbed in the same way that beach sand is not good for concrete because it's rounded. You have to have concrete where you have to have sand with sharp edges to bind. And I think it's the same idea. It's just crap to throw into the concrete because it's a cheap, inert fill. That's it.
But cheap is one word, and that becomes a filler. Yeah. But what you actually want is the chemical or the physical properties of what's termed a functional filler. So if you can fill a concrete with something that creates a mesh in it, like a fiber that creates a mesh, you will get increased strength and potentially at decreased weight.
Yeah, if you chop this up and it's rough, you have rough
cement that use functional fillers. That's what you're talking about. My end member was centispheres are the most functional filler in a space shuttle cement. So that's because of the chemical bond at light weight. That's a bond chemically. In that case, it forms part of the cement. It reacts. The surface reacts. It doesn't dissolve the sphere. The sphere stays intact, but it allows the calcium alumina silicate reactions that a cement is.
Well, that's a chemical bond.
So you're talking about functional fillers there, and there are many in the world, and you can use functional fillers for thermal properties. You know, a fire retardant is a functional filler. So if you get plastic that doesn't burn, how do you do that? You stick a mineral when it burns, it puts itself out.
Well, the thing is, my understanding is a rough particle and it's a mechanical bond, not a chemical bond. Your centispheres are a chemical bond with the glue, and the chopped up blade trash would be just like this rough chunk that the concrete mechanically adheres to or grabs or is locked in rather than chemically. I believe that's what the intent is of chopping it up and throwing it in concrete. It's a rough piece of gravel. Yeah.
The gravel's a bit different. In a concrete, you do put that in there because you don't want the same particle sizing throughout. So a cement is weak if it's all of the same particle size and all the bonds are in the same direction and angle. You want energy to be dispersed around different particle sizes. So
then chop it up into different sizes and throw it in.
Yeah, correct. But that's just utilization. That's just recycling of a waste.
Yes.
I'm comfortable with waste recycling, very comfortable with that. But I'm not going to pay you for your waste. Okay, but I'll pay you for your silica centisphere. So it's a function of a commercial use related, and this is where society has to realize that we're talking about creating compound structures, energies that are very, very useful for mankind going forward. And we're driven clean and green. Yeah, we're not the baddies of this world. We're actually we're the maximum recyclers.
Right. Right.
Exactly. Very good. And on that note, I think we're beginning to near the end of this webcast. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to listen to. It was a lot of fun to participate in. And
thanks for putting it together, Yrsa.
Yeah. Of course. It was
thank you. Yeah, that was great for your organization. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been super fun, and let's do it again.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you, everybody, and take care. Have a good morning or night, whatever you have.